Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for being here. We're so glad that you joined our workshop today and just really want to thank you for joining. Before we get started, as you're getting settled in, I just want to take a moment to ensure that everyone in the audience is ready and comfortable with the technical aspects of the webinar so that you know how to navigate any technical aspects as we continue our webinar. As you will see, closed captioning is available. We also have American Sign Language interpreters in this meeting. Thank you so much for our interpreters for being here. And those capabilities are enabled in the meeting. You can actually activate that by clicking the interpretation icon on your Zoom navigation bar. If you need tech support during today's webinar, please send a chat message to the hosts and we will address those for you. We are here to support you, so if anything comes up, please reach out to us. And finally, we encourage you to ask questions throughout and are inviting you to enter the questions into the Q&A area. It's also a button that's available to you. We're going to receive those questions directly and we'll be able to provide them to our facilitator when that time comes. So please feel free to use that feature. We would love to hear from you and encourage your participation today. We are here today to talk about workforce wellness, post-crisis debriefing and processing. Before we get started, I'd like to go through a disclaimer, so if we can go to the next slide. I would like to note that the views expressed in written conference materials or publications and by speakers and moderators do not necessarily reflect the official policies of the Department of Health and Human Services and the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, nor does it mention of trade names, commercial practices, or organizations imply endorsements by the U.S. government. Next slide, please. So I'd like to introduce myself today. My name is Lydia Hernai. I am a behavioral health project manager at Altarum. Today's webinar is hosted by SAMHSA's 988 Crisis Systems Response Training and Technical Assistance Center. That is a mouthful, so from now on, I'm going to refer to that as the CSR-TTAC. And SAMHSA has selected Altarum to provide training and technical assistance support to states, territories, tribal organizations, and community partners across the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline and Crisis Continuum of Care. So along with our partners, W2 Consulting Corporation and Change Matrix LLC, who have extensive experience with crisis services and technical assistance, the CSR-TTAC was formed to support the continued growth of the 988 Lifeline and build a more robust crisis care system. So the goal of the Crisis Systems Response TTAC is to support a crisis care system that is integrated, sustainable, and aligned with evidence-based and evidence-informed practices. I believe someone is going to share a bit more information about the TTAC there. I'd like to acknowledge and thank our SAMHSA leadership team as well. Dr. John Palmieri is a senior medical advisor at SAMHSA and is currently serving as the acting director of the 988 and Behavioral Health Crisis Coordinating Office within the Office of the Assistant Secretary. Next slide, please. Jill Mays is the Division Director for Crisis Systems Transformation for the 988 and Behavioral Health Crisis Coordinating Office at SAMHSA, and she currently leads the evolutionary and collaborative work of Pillars 2, just someone to respond, and 3, a safe place to help of the 988 Behavioral Health Crisis Continuum. And next slide, please. And finally, Captain Corey Palmer is a commissioned officer in the U.S. Public Health Service with over 20 years of experience improving health outcomes and increasing access to quality health care. Currently, he serves as the workforce lead for the Behavioral Health Crisis Transformation Team in the 988 and Behavioral Health Crisis Coordination Office. Next slide, please. We'd like to take a moment to hear from you and understand who we have here in the audience. So, in just a moment, we are going to launch a poll that we're encouraging all of you to please respond to, letting us know what pillar of the crisis system you work in, and then what is your role within that system. So, I'm going to give you just a couple minutes um, to provide that information and take the poll. All right, and hopefully you've had a chance to take the poll. Let us know who's here so that we can get a better sense of the audience. Thank you, and I'm seeing the results now. So it looks like we have a good mix of folks from the three pillars. Thank you so much for taking this and letting us know who's here and what your role is. Um, wow, this is great. Thank you so much for that. We appreciate your participation there. Next slide, please. Okay, so I want to orient us to this session today to prepare for our discussion and just give you a brief overview of the objectives that we have planned for today. So first, we're going to identify structured debriefing techniques that support the workforce in recovering after crisis. We're going to work to understand signs of cumulative stress, and we're going to work to identify organizational strategies to support implementation of structured debriefing. Also, just want to mention that we are all here in some way or another from the field of behavioral health crisis work, and want to acknowledge that topics discussed during this webinar may be sensitive or activating. We are going to talk about working through debriefing through trauma and crisis. And so just want to really encourage everyone to please also prioritize your well-being throughout this session as well. Um, as professionals in the behavioral health space, we know that this work can sometimes activate our own experiences. And we will be asking some questions and reflections of you today. And so those questions are really meant to support reflection. We encourage you to share only what feels comfortable to you, understanding that listening quietly is also equally meaningful. And also just want to acknowledge that our presenter has graciously offered to her contact information to anyone who might need a bit more processing after the session. And we are definitely we're excited to get started with that. So can you please go to the next slide? And right now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Our speaker is Lisa Denhofer. Lisa is a certified phenologist specializing in traumatic loss, trauma-informed coach and consultant, trained counselor, and a crisis communication specialist with over 20 years of experience in the field, drawing on both professional expertise and firsthand experience during major workplace tragedies, including the 1993 World Trade Center bombing and 9/11. Lisa helps teams implement structured debriefing techniques and build resilience. We are so glad that Lisa is here. Next slide, please. And at this time, I'm going to hand it over to Lisa to get started. And Lisa?
Thank you so much, Lydia. And I just want to thank you for inviting me to participate in this project with you. And to those who are attending, you may not realize, but there's a whole panel of people present. You can't see them on the screen, but they are here, ensuring that everything on the back end, the technology and everything works the way it's supposed to. So I very much appreciate them. And I feel very much assured that they are here. So next slide, please. This is my own, you know, statement. I'm not going to read this. You're going to get all of this in a handout, so feel free to, read this disclaimer. You'll get that in the handout. Next slide, please. So I want to be very clear that workplace well-being, including psychological safety, is a leadership function. It has to be a leadership function because employees don't have the authority to do that. And the well-being of a workplace ecosystem is very much dependent on the health of that ecosystem. And well-being should, in a perfect world, be the constant state of being, not something you reach to after an event. Next slide, please. So I'd like to put these questions to you for your consideration whilst you're attending today, and then we're going to circle back and see what your answers are. But I'm very interested in knowing if you've had a debriefing experience as a facilitator that you would describe as having a poor outcome. And why would you describe it that way? Is there a type of case or content for a debriefing that you are uncomfortable dealing with or you feel less confident with, and why? And do you struggle with facilitating debriefings that are close to your own personal experience? Maybe what happened, an event is very similar to what happened to you, and that you worry that it might be triggering for you whilst you are facilitating this debriefing. So just have a think, let those questions simmer, and we will circle back to that at the near the end. Next slide, please. So those in leadership positions, whether, those are supervisors or all the way up to senior leaders, they need debriefing too in the wake of a disruptive event in the workplace. And without it, they run the risk of making things worse for their people. They run the risk of making it harder for that ecosystem to recover. And it can create perception issues around their competence and their capacity to lead. Because what happens when leadership doesn't receive the kind of care that staff is receiving? I mean, not necessarily in the same at the same time. I work with leadership separately, but they get in this trap of masking. I'm fine. I'm fine. And so all the energy goes to keeping that mask of I'm fine running. And so they're not really present. They're not really seeing and hearing within their people what they need to, and it affects the kinds of decisions that they make. Next slide, please. So we live in a time where being trained and trauma informed is now a necessary competency for leaders. Again, supervisors all the way up to senior leaders. And they need to have a basic understanding of human biology, both the neurobiology and physical biology, that corresponds with the behavioral responses that human beings will express following a traumatic event, from a workplace disruption, an acute stress event, trauma, grief from both death and non-death losses, because a non-death loss is just as stressful and registers in the brain as a threat as much as a physical death loss and can create just as much grief. They really need to bone up and become skilled at effective crisis communication. And I really saw the gap in that during COVID, when so many supposed workplace gurus were coming out telling leaders, you should be over communicating right now. Well, that wasn't helpful, and that's just as bad as telling people they should be under communicating. Leaders really need to understand crisis communication because of the kinds of events that are happening in the workplace now that 20 years ago was unthinkable, including active shooting, active stabbings, and suicides being completed in the workplace. And to understand after the initial impact of this event, a realistic understanding of really how long it's going to take for this ecosystem to sort itself out and get kind of stabilized, right? And some of the additional kinds of issues that will come up post-event. And when I go into an organization that's had particularly a shock trauma event, I right away help leadership to understand that their expectations for how quickly this is going to get sorted are really low. And I tell them right away, think a year. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody for a year is going to be in the situation that they're in now in terms of their capacity and functioning, but it's really going to take a year for your organization to settle down, get back to a level of functioning, for people to feel safe again, particularly when there's a breach of psychological safety. That can take quite a while. And trauma is tricky, right? It doesn't follow a timeline, it doesn't follow a calendar. And someone can be seeming to do okay, 3 months after the event, and then one day they get into the parking lot and they can't get out of the car. And they call up a mate in the office and they say, I'm in the car, come get me. I can't walk through the front door. And because people have mythologies around how trauma works, how it expresses itself, unfortunately, at that time frame, there's a tendency to claim that this person is malingering, they just want a day off, they're a discipline issue, and that's not true. This is why I say the reality of how trauma works. So there needs to be that basic understanding with senior leaders and people in human resources. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to read all of this for you. As I said, this is also serving as a handout for your reference later on. But acute stress responses after a traumatic event, also known as trauma responses, are numerous and they will co-express. And what you find throughout here is a real disruption in our cognitive abilities. And if you look to the right of the screen at the top, you see cognitive organizational issues. This is a very common state of being following a traumatic event. Our brain has a very hard time doing the simplest of tasks. Sorting through our mail seems to be a tall order. Keeping appointments, staying organized. It seems to be really difficult after a traumatic event, as well as all of these other symptoms that you see on the slide. Next slide, please. What you'll notice is that chronic stress symptoms, which is different from trauma symptoms, there's a lot of resonance. There's a lot of the same kind of cognitive disruption in terms of memory and concentration issues and cognitive organizational issues, but word retrieval issues is very common. And the reason for that is that inside of our brain, we have all these little, very, very fine things called filaments. And those filaments literally connect every part of our brain together. And when we are under too much stress for too long, those filaments become brittle and they snap. That's why we can't bring the word forward. We know the word for what we're looking at, but we cannot get it out of our head through our mouth, right? And it's kind of a warning system. The brain is saying, hey, I need some attention here. I need a rest, right? So trauma responses and chronic stress responses have similarities, but they are not necessarily exactly the same thing. But they both take way longer than what people anticipate to sort out. Next slide, please. So I want to clarify some of the states that people who work with a lot of trauma as part of their job or not, a lot of these terms are used inappropriately, and burnout is one of them. It drives me crazy how the term burnout is used inaccurately almost all the time now. Burnout is not a synonym for exhaustion. Burnout is a very specific condition. It is induced by the workplace environment, not the work itself. right? And it is always an organizational issue, not an individual one. And if you follow Christina Maslach, my hero, on burnout, she's the person that first identified that burnout is coming from organizational ecosystems, not the individual. And there are very specific symptoms to burnout. One of them is exhaustion, but if it's just, you know, total exhaustion you're feeling, that's usually the result of hyperproductivity. Burnout has issues of apathy, depersonalization, cynicism, rage, a loss of interest in the work. And there are a lot of drivers around that. But I want you to really understand that burnout is not about the work, it's about the workplace itself. Next slide, please. So I'm not wild about the term empathy fatigue or compassion fatigue, but it is recognizable to most of you, so I'm using it here. But this is about the work, but it's not really the work that you're doing. It's the loss of meaning or satisfaction you are getting from the work. Right? I just want you to think about that for a second. It's the loss of meaning and satisfaction from the work. It doesn't mean you don't have the capacity to feel empathy anymore. That's not the reason. It is an individual challenge and an individual outcome, not an organizational issue. And it is frequently expressed within those who have jobs that require a lot of emotional labor. First responders, teachers, um, crisis call workers, social workers, child protective service workers. And one of the reasons why the meaning starts to evaporate when there's not sufficient ongoing attention to self is because our brains are exquisitely hardwired to activate, to rise, to meet a challenge, solve that challenge, and then downregulate again. You stay within that area of eustress, known as, that stress with intolerance. If you look at a polyvagal chart, it's right in the middle. You're not going into overwhelm, right, into the sympathetic activation response in overwhelm. You're staying in that middle area, stress with intolerance, what we're hardwired. But then you have to be able to downregulate. There has to be relief. There has to be abatement. There has to be that satisfaction of, I solved this. We are living in a time now of competing stressors where we are constantly persevering, we're constantly gearing up to face a stressor, but we're not solving the issue. We're not solving the problem. We're just in a constant state of perseverance without that abatement. And human beings aren't built for that. And it's crazy making for human beings. And it can really erode our ability to create meaning around what we're doing. Next slide, please. So it's important to know if you're being sent out to do a debriefing, maybe with a group of people in an organization, or you're doing a one-on-one, you need to know what you're actually doing. Because if you look up debriefing, you'll see that it's used in a lot of different ways. Our terms get misused and words matter. So, right? So you have to know, are you diffusing a situation? Are you debriefing? Are you doing psychological first aid? Or are you doing some check-ins? So psychological first aid is really about immediately after an event, even if the event isn't over, but that person is now in safety. You help them get to a place of feeling safe. They're not in danger anymore. You get them information. You get them comfort, both physical comfort, maybe the foil blanket to keep the heat in, to keep from going into shock, and also psychological comfort of you're safe. And that's where also you explain to them services that they can get with a psychological professional after that. It's not debriefing, you're giving first aid. Diffusing is when you are trying to literally diffuse anger so it does not erupt into an act of violence or some other major issue. You're trying to lower the temperature. Check-ins is for people, co-workers, mates, and also people in leadership, going to someone and say, hey, just checking in with you. How's it going? I know you had a really tough case last week, or it sounded like you had a really hard call earlier in the day. You all right? just checking in. Debriefing is different. It's a different process that we're going to get into in a little bit, but I just want you to get clear about what are you actually doing when you go to sit in the seat of service with someone after a disruptive event. Next slide, please. So what are some examples of events that require, debriefing and diffusing or check-ins? So for workplace trauma, there are three buckets of workplace trauma. One is shock trauma, like an active shooter or a natural disaster and the roof caves in, or someone completes suicide in the workplace. And also, now it can happen virtually. We're in a meeting with someone and we see them be physically attacked by an abuser in the house. That's very traumatizing to watch. Or you're on a call and the perpetrator in the home or wherever you're calling doesn't realize this person has called a hotline. So they don't have any sense that they have to hide what they're doing, right? And you're hearing somebody be mortally wounded or fatally wounded. So there's shock trauma events. There is, oh, and one more thing. With the shock trauma events, it doesn't necessarily have to happen in the workplace. It can happen to the workplace. And what I mean by that is last December, United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson was murdered in New York City on his way to a meeting. And that I wrote an article about that. If you want to go to my website, go onto the blog page, you'll see an article I wrote about that. This was an example of not only a traumatic loss, but a multiple loss for those employees. And I explain why that is. It was disheartening to me when a video was leaked. Andrew, the former CEO of the Umbrella Corporation, said to people, I know this is really upsetting. If you need help, call the EAP. That is really wholly insufficient for what happened. They needed to, and hopefully they did, take a much more um, hands-on approach to do debriefings on site and to continue help with these people. And I lay out in that article why that was necessary. Next, oh, excuse me. And so the second bucket for workplace trauma is role-related trauma. So your job, your role puts you in the path of chronic exposure to graphic material. That can be, you're sitting on a crisis hotline, you're in law enforcement, you're a teacher, you're a child protective service worker, you are experienced medical and physical medical professionals and mental health care professionals. So you are constantly exposed to trauma. And if there is not enough in terms of debriefing and other psychological care, it can really get to you. Specifically those even who track pedophiles online. It used to be with the FBI, I don't know if it's still the case, but those agents that were assigned to that, they could only work that job for 3 years and then they would be reassigned because the FBI realized what it does to people, right? But it's not just them. Those attorneys, particularly at the Justice Department, who want to prosecute, well, in order to prosecute, they have to put themselves in the way of very disturbing videos, photos, and hundreds of those photos bringing the case together. And that can have a really deleterious effect on their mental health. And unfortunately, with the Justice Department, they cannot seek counseling for that. They can seek counseling if they're getting divorced, and it won't involve their having to report that for their clearance, but something like this, they would have to report it to the clearance. So what they told me when they approached me a long time ago to do some work with them, they can receive this information in terms of educations, right? So psychosocial education is really important. I'm going to get into that in a minute. Next slide, please. So debriefing is not about getting people to feel better, and it is not about the facilitator creating meaning for those participants. You cannot do that. And I've seen people, best of intention, nurses and other care providers try to do that, but it will always backfire for you because meaning making has to be a self-initiated, self-constructed act. for it to have meaning. The person has to own it. So debriefing is not about you getting people to feel that way. Now, debriefing can help people find that meaning making for themselves in the conversation that you are sponsoring for them, and that's always a very positive thing when that happens. Next slide, please. So internal trauma teams, I don't, I have not seen them have a lot of very good outcomes. They used to be very popular in social service agencies and they kind of fell by the wayside because nobody was calling on those teams. And it's not because they weren't experiencing trauma in their job, it's because competency is a very strong identity marker for social workers and other mental health care professionals and other kinds of professions. And they'd rather have needles stuck in their eyes than go to their colleagues and say, I'm in trouble, right? Because there's a fear of they're not going to see me as reliable or as capable later on. So they keep it to themselves. So debriefing really needs to happen by someone who's not on that team, particularly because when you're doing debriefing, you're also bringing out details of what happened. And what we saw with trauma teams is it was spreading the trauma through a secondary exposure. So that is not helpful to people on a team. Next slide, please. So the types of debriefing, the word has a lot of different meanings. Within a military standpoint, debriefing can often be to get information after something has happened. If it's immediate, sometimes it's called a hot wash. If it's 2 weeks to a month after, that might be called, a case review. Um, Another kind of debriefing is to debrief after a very disruptive event for the purpose of creating safe ventilation, for providing that psychosocial education, for normalizing what people are experiencing, and to help set realistic expectations, to help inspire reflection. And most importantly, the facilitator wants to inspire social connection between the people in that room, which hopefully leads to social capital building because that's where strength is. Our brain, after an event like this, is spitting out a stress hormone called oxytocin. And that compels human beings to reach out for social connection because the brain understands we have a better chance of survival when we are connected to someone else than when we are on our own. Now, there's another kind of debriefing called psychological debriefing. It used to be called critical incident stress debriefing. This has a lot of mixed reviews. The research on this is not consistent in that it being effective. It was originally devised thinking that it would reduce the incidence of developing post-traumatic stress, and actually, in a lot of instances, September 11th being one of them, it actually increased the incidence of that. It's got a very rigid format, and there's a lot of training that has to go into this. Psychological debriefing is not what you are doing when you're doing a post-event debriefing. Next slide, please. So one of the things you have to be very aware of as a facilitator when you're walking in after to do a post-event debriefing is you have to understand the impact of the exposure, primary and secondary exposure, and the impact. So we know that people can exhibit the same debilitating symptoms whether their exposure to this event was primary, like they clapped eyes and they saw it, or secondary, that they just heard about it. And one of the most, I don't want to say famous, but well understood events of this was September 11th. People out in California were developing the same symptoms of secondary traumatic stress that people in New York were experiencing just by watching the television, the constant looping of television. People in New York who were not in New York City at the time, but the constant looping and the funerals in the streets every day and the thumbnails of everybody who was killed in the newspaper for months and months and reading the details we can experience, our brain will register that as a threat and we can experience the same kinds of symptoms, and that's secondary exposure. I came up with a model called the concentric circles model of impact. And so when I'm going onto an organization after there's been an event like a shock trauma, I spend a lot of time gathering information to understand who was where at the time. Proximity to an event is not necessarily an indicator to developing post-traumatic stress, and it is not an indicator that you have not been impacted. So what do I mean by that? So think in terms of concentric circles, where the circle in the middle right here, you were in the room, you saw it. You have primary, extreme primary impact. You were in the room there. The second circle, think that you were outside of the room, but you heard everything going on. You didn't see anything, but you heard it and you knew what you were listening to. And as you go through the organization, these circles get wider and wider and wider. But the tendency is to believe, let's say the event happened way in the back of the building, so, oh, our receptionist is not impacted. That would be an inaccurate assumption. What happens in an ecosystem impacts everybody in that ecosystem, but just in different ways. And different isn't less than. It's important to know that impact and to be able to, from a leadership standpoint, be able to address that impact at the varying different levels that it is expressing itself in your organization so that you have an idea of how to strategize going forward for the next 6 months and the next year. Next slide, please. So those who have been impacted, you should not be facilitating a debriefing. You have been impacted, right? When this is the case, a separate person from the outside is your best choice of coming in. They're what I call Switzerland, right? When I go into an organization, I'm not part of the political environment there. I'm not part of the dynamic in the ecosystem. I have nothing to do with people's paycheck or their promote or anything else. I'm really vanilla in terms of being completely what do I want to say, non-biased at all. But I wasn't impacted by that debriefing. If you've been impacted, you're not going to facilitate a debriefing in the same way as if you were not, and you will not have as good outcomes. Next slide, please. So in terms of a debriefing, the most important thing about the success of your debriefing is the personal preparation you go into before you start this process. So the gathering of information is critical. So whoever your contact person is, if you're being called in to do a debriefing, or you're being called in from maybe another area of the organization, maybe not necessarily from the outside, but from another area of the organization, whoever you're working with as your contact person there, you need to really know as much of the details as is available, right? And the information they offer you, they're impacted too. So they're just telling you what they think you need. Don't be afraid to ask a lot of questions in terms of who's going to be there today, how do they relate to each other, is leadership in the room or not, in terms of yourself, and also with the event, you need all of the details about the event, and I like to get details about what led up to that event, what's happened before. In terms of personal preparation, basically, where's your central nervous system? Are you activated going in? If that's the case, you need to do breathing and you need to do exercises to get your central nervous system down-regulated and under control because your central nervous system impacts theirs. That's what co-regulation is all about, right? So are you, reviewing assumptions? Are they inaccurate assumptions? Are you putting them to reality testing? Are you asking yourself, I don't know what to say. What should I say? Whatever is happening with you, get that under control and get that sorted so that you can walk in basically as a blank page. You have all the space necessary to hold whatever those participants are going to throw on you and that you are going to need to help them, work through. Do you become aware of narratives in your head about what you think this story is, or are you rehearsing outcomes? If you're doing that, it's getting in the way of what you're going to be able to do. So whatever exercises you do, and I do have a specific exercise for this. I won't go through it now. Maybe we'll have time later, but I call it containment and compartmentalization exercises. So all your stuff is very um, respectfully and carefully put in a container that you create, and then it is put in a place where it is contained, and it is there for safekeeping emotionally, psychologically, so that you can get on with the business of facilitating. And I can teach that to you later if we have time. Next slide, please. So on arrival, you want to connect with leadership and evaluate how they are doing. Find out if they are going to avail themselves of any kind of help in terms of debriefing or anything else. And if they're resisting, do your best to encourage them to do that. If they're planning on sitting in on the debriefing, I have no problem with that, and I have found that to be very helpful. But also we have to be mindful of dynamics that we might not be aware of. So if leadership is planning on being there, I always say to them, if I'm getting any indication that staff is not willing to participate in this because you are there, I'm going to very respectfully ask you to leave the room, and I will work with you separately. But right now, I'm going in there to work with your staff, and anything that's going to impede that is a waste of your valuable resources and your time. And we get a consensus on that. Assessing the location. Where is this going to happen? Go in, look at the room if you have time. How are you going to set up the chairs? I'm not big on desks and tables. So if I can move those out of the way, I will. If I can't, I put myself in a place where everyone can see me very easily. No one has to crane their neck, and I can see them. You want to understand the participants. How are they related to each other? Are they in different departments? Do they know each other even? Maybe the organization is so large they don't even know each other. And is this a mix that will bring success, or do you need to maybe think about doing some separate debriefings? So, your palpable presence. I really want to encourage you to know your talent, know your skill, and understand that the success of a debriefing is not necessarily following a script or steps. These are nice things to know. These are helpful to know. But at the end of the day, the success or the failure of this debriefing is about how are you showing up? Who are you showing up as? And how are you connecting with them? And how are you helping them connect with each other? Know the way that you have your gift and how to make that happen. Debriefing is an art. It's not a checklist. It is an art. And the more you do and the harder they are that you're out there doing, the better you get at it. And don't be afraid to change your mind about what you are intending on doing. Let's say, well, we've been given an hour. You know what? I tell people that's usually not enough time because it takes a while for people to, you know, feel comfortable to speak up. But I had one debriefing once, it lasted 3 hours because it needed to. And leadership was surprised, but they understood why ultimately it became necessary. So you are facilitating this conversation. Your confidence in yourself and your gift is mission critical. It's way more important than some checklist of what to do or what not to do. And every debriefing will be different. So if you're focusing on what should I say, you're already not present when you're walking into the room. Your confidence in knowing that you can address properly anything that comes your way relieves you of the anxiety around what should I say or what should I not say. Modulating your voice and the volume of your voice and the pacing becomes very important. empathetic inquiry, how you ask questions, and the gut instinct you get on what's the next question I need to ask? How deep should I go with this person? Right? I read people. I work very intuitively with people, and I trust my gut as much as I trust my head, and I use that, in a balanced fashion. We're given both for a reason. Helping people find language to describe what has happened to them is very helpful. As Dr. Danny Siegel says, you have to name it to tame it. Once people can verbalize and articulate what happened and its impact on them, that's the first step in helping them get their arms around what has happened, and move forward. You want to pay real close attention to those nonverbal cues, reading body language, reading facial English, and reading the energy in the room. I really mean it. You've got to read the room and pick up on nonverbal cues that people are having in relationship to other people when they're speaking, and picking up on those dynamics. This is the time for psychosocial education. It's not a breakout session for a conference, but this is where you want to help people normalize what they're feeling, help them create reasonable expectations, help them get to a place where they can reflect on what has happened to them. And as you're working with people, you want to be clocking who you think is going to need more help when you are finished with this session. Next slide, please. So I never, ever go on site to do a debriefing with a group without scheduling enough time for some one-on-one sessions after the group debriefing is over. There are people who just may not be able to speak up, or you've got something going in their head and they need to unpack it at that time. So I advise you to always do that. If you're going to debrief somebody one-on-one, then you don't have to worry about that. You're already doing it. And I always, always, always meet with leadership afterwards, whether it's a one-on-one or a group, to review with them what I'm picking up, my observations, and my recommendations for them and the organization for going forward. Next slide, please. So this is something I rarely see talked about. Any emphasis on you, the facilitator? This is a task with heavy emotional labor. You're just a person, you're not a machine. And so it is possible that doing a debriefing, for whatever reason, can activate something within you, right? It can also expose you and lead to secondary traumatic stress. And you don't expect it, but it can happen. It can also lead, unexpectedly perhaps, to an incident of moral distress, right? And moral distress is when you come upon something that violates your core professional ethical code, or your human ethical code, your core of conduct, and you feel constrained for whatever reason for speaking up or being able to prevent that. Remember, you are going into a context of chaos, so you have to leave room for the unexpected. And if you did get triggered, or that residue from a previous trauma event that you had got activated, well, that is a notification that more work is needed on this, right? It's also a notification that maybe the containment and compartmentalization exercise you did wasn't quite enough, right? So it's not a bat to beat yourself with, and it is not an indicator that you're broken. It's an alarm system. It's a notification system. It's information. It is your observer self coming forward, talking to you, and giving you an insight into something that will help you be better helping others, right? Next slide, please. So this is one of the things that can come up, way post-event. We saw a lot of this in COVID. We are still experiencing, some of this from COVID. And one thing in here that I meant to put on this slide, if you want to put it in your notes, is a reduction of self-regulation, the ability to control yourself. So when we are in constant crisis, it's one crisis after another, which leadership today, they're facing this and they are suffering with this. I've got a client right now who has hit the wall. He is a CEO. He has been in under one major stressor in the workplace after another for 5 years, and he has just recently hit the wall. And we've been working on what he needs to do to step back for a limited amount of time so that he can literally begin to heal and titrate back up, but not titrate back up to where he was that led to this, but titrate back up to a place that is healthier and he can function. So chronic survival mode thinking and survival mode behavior is hard on our brain and it's hard on our body. And our brains tend to start going into a very binary place of it has to be this or that because it's just too complicated in terms of making decisions to see the gray area. And we can make mistakes in making those decisions. We get tired of being exposed to chronic suffering and the risk analysis and the complexity of decision making. We stop making those decisions, and the chronic uncertainty is very hard, particularly on the brain. The brain likes certainty because the brain equates certainty with safety. So this is a very real thing. And it doesn't just affect people in leadership, it affects everybody if they're in this situation. Next slide, please. So workplace well-being, very quickly. The building of social capital, anything that leaders can do to help people in their workplaces connect with each other. This is medicine to their brain. It's going to be great for the functioning of your teams. This can be really challenging to do if there's been a toxic leader or a bully in the workplace that caused people to be at each other's throats and fracture. You've really got to get on this and begin that healing process with a debriefing about that to build that social capital. Fika is a wonderful practice. It is a Swedish practice. We would call it a coffee break, but the actual technical translation of this is collective restoration. Swedish companies do this twice a day. There's always really great pastries and coffee or tea. People look forward to it. And I just instituted this in one of my clients and they love it. They absolutely love it. At first, they kind of looked at me like, really? Are you kidding? But they have found that it helps with their relationship building. It has helped them get through some pretty difficult times that they've had lately that have been kind of tearing at the structure of their interpersonal relationships. And they look forward to it now. And it's very well attended. And regular check-ins. If you are, in leadership, to be checking in with particularly people on hotlines. I've worked hotlines. I know what that's like. I've walked in your shoes. How you doing? Sounded like you had a really bad call there. Or, maybe someone completed a suicide while they were on that call. That absolutely requires attention. But check-ins aren't just from people in leadership. It can be your mate, just how are you? How you doing? And get that person talking a little bit, right? There's really something to be said about ventilation. And it doesn't have to be a big, deep, long conversation. When you're checking in with somebody, what you are acknowledging to them is, I see you and you matter and I hear you. And at the end of the day, human beings just want to be seen and heard. So these can be, they're very simple. They can take less than 5 minutes, but the power is in the consistency and the authenticity of how check-ins are done. Next slide, please. All right, so let's talk about resilience. Next slide. So I'm not a big fan of the American Psychological Association's definition of resilience. I prefer, which is about, bouncing back, and I prefer the Stockholm Resilience Center definition and paradigm of resilience. The three pillars of rising up to persevere and persist through a challenge, which our brains are hardwired to do. But the thing is, when we get activated, our brains are hardwired to meet that stressor for a limited period of time. It's not supposed to be a lifestyle. And traditional Western culture has created the culture where stress is a lifestyle. And this is why mental well-being, and we're in such trouble in this country with that, because we're just activated too long and too often. But the first pillar is the perseverance, the rising up and persevering. And whilst you're doing that, you are adapting to the challenge. You are adapting to this and what it's requiring of you. And while you're doing that, pretty soon you begin transforming, right? You're building some new skills from that, and you are better equipped for the future and the challenges. Now, the thing about resilience is that it's built during a stressor, not when everything is great, right? So just doing workshops around resilience when there's nothing stressful happening, well, it's great from a psychosocial education standpoint, but you're not going to really build that resilience when you're not actively working against a challenge and adapting neurobiologically and physically to that challenge to get to some resolution. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to read all of this, but there are very specific resilience building factors, and I put this one in red: meaningful connections. Being connected to other people is mission critical to building resilience. Right? When we feel isolated, we're not able to do it. So I'm not gonna, you can read this, in the handout, and I want to focus on the non-toxic gratitude for a second. I've put that in there because of the prevalence of what's commonly known now as toxic positivity, that in Western culture, apparently, we're not allowed to express the full spectrum of feelings that we come equipped with as human beings. And we now have feelings that are under the heading of positive and negative. I don't embrace that mindset at all. We come equipped with anger and sadness and all those other things that are supposedly negative for a reason. It's all about the balance, but it's okay for us to feel really upset when something bad happens. We have good reason for it. And when we allow people to sit in their feelings and then move forward, it's much better than to tell them they should be resisting it. And unfortunately, gratitude is another word that has been misused. The worst possible thing you can do when someone is experiencing a loss, whether it's a physical death loss or a non-death loss, is to again come in with these platitudes around, that are meant for meaning making of, well, other people have it worse, or it could have been worse, be grateful it wasn't this or that. That is so unhelpful. And usually what that does is it results in resentment. Again, that meaning making process has to be self-initiated and self-constructed. When people view it that way, when they see it through that filter, then it has meaning and then it is useful to them. But they have to be there to do that. And it can take some time to get to a place of gratitude. I see this in people I'm working with who are going through really difficult divorces. Down the road, they may be very glad and grateful that they got divorced, but when they're in the middle of it, not so much, right? So we have to be careful how we use that term gratitude. Next slide, please. So in the resilience failure factors, what you'll see is really the opposite to what was on the previous page. And when there is a resistance to be reflective, when there's a resistance to allow oneself to get help, when there's a resistance to coping, um, this will obstruct your ability to build resilience during this particular stressor and perhaps going forward. Next slide, please. So there really is such a thing as resilience fatigue. Next slide, please. So again, I won't go through all of this, but I'm going to highlight the one in red. Resilience fatigue is not about laziness. It's not about feeling sorry for yourself. It's really about hitting a wall, and you just cannot, your brain and your body just cannot rise up to continue trying. There's a sense of fatigue and helplessness from that lack of resolution. It goes back to what I said very earlier today, that human beings, they'll rise up to a challenge and they can persevere, but they have to be able to experience in a reasonable amount of time the abatement or the resolution of what they're persevering against. Otherwise, it's really hard to build that resilience and feel like, yeah, there's light at the end of the tunnel. Next slide, please. So drivers of resilience fatigue, a lot of what I've been talking about today, complex trauma for sure, when you've had one trauma experience after another, multiple loss situations, not enough recovery time between the disruptions that are coming into your life. Human beings need that. That's a neurobiological issue for us. When we're getting activated on that polyvagal system too often and for too long, without downregulating and having enough time to reset to get activated again. You just cannot outrun your biology. And we just hit a wall, right? We just totally hit a wall. Next slide, please. So some things that can be done to heal resilience fatigue is the very thing that people have been surviving by, and that is masking, pretending that everything is okay. And to drop that and to just be very authentic in the place that you are in is a first step to healing resilience fatigue. You got to be in a place where you can just be, just be. I spoke with somebody recently who's going through a very hard time, and he looked at me and he said, I'm in a position I just can't be jacked with right now. I don't have the tolerance. I don't have the tolerance to meet up to meet these challenges. I can't be in conversation with people. I can't be responsive. I just need quiet and I need alone time, and my family's not understanding this. So radical rest really means radical. And he decided to check into a hotel, not because he wants to get away from people, but because he just needs a place where he can just be and not have to explain himself. And there's complete quiet, so his central nervous system can start calming down. Going to a place of allowing of what is. I see resilience fatigue, by the way, in people who are going through very long, protracted divorces or legal cases, things that are just dragging on and on that are very high stakes for them. Telling people what you need from them will reduce their anxiety and the expectation on you that you're not participating in the relationship the way they want, that you just cannot. If you're engaging in ineffective coping mechanisms like, drinking or doing drugs or gambling or excessive shopping or whatever that is, there needs to be an acknowledging of that and a stopping of that and taking on coping mechanisms that are effective. And this is the most important thing. Figuring out what brings meaning to your life and spend a lot of time swimming in that. We can lose sight. Resilience fatigue brings about a sense of helplessness and hopelessness, and that my life has no meaning. So if we can re-identify or rediscover what brings meaning in our life and do what we can to stay in that space as much as we can, it can be very helpful in coming back from resilience fatigue, and simplifying everything is a must. Next slide, please. So some methods for healing resilience fatigue. Again, you can read all of these for your handout, but I'll highlight a couple. Nixen is a Danish practice, and it roughly translates to doing nothing. And this is very much accepted in the Danish culture, that every single thing they do doesn't have to be towards producing an outcome or producing a product. You can just sit and look out the window. You can just sit outside. You're not criticized for that. And I have actually assigned Nixen as homework assignments to people who have hit the wall and who are flat out and who have trouble allowing themselves to not be in a constant state of production. Creative play, again, doing something for the process, not with the expectation of producing that artwork or whatever it is, but creative play, right brain activities, spiritual engagement and inspiration. And small accomplishments. This can really help. Small accomplishments. Clean out the desk drawer. Clean out the closet. Sweep the front stoop. They don't have to be big, huge things, but the more small accomplishments that we can do, it becomes incremental and it starts giving us a sense of empowerment and integrity, sovereignty and integrity within ourselves, and some hope that we're still in there and we can find ourselves again. Next slide, please. So if you're not familiar with Lisa Feldman Barrett's work, she's fabulous. She's got 2 books out. She did a really, really good interview with Kelly Corrigan, PBS Kelly Corrigan, who had a TV show called Tell Me More. You go to PBS and you go into the archive of her show. It's about a half an hour. And she just has a great outlook on the power of human beings have on each other's central nervous system, and our ability to calm each other and our ability to calm ourselves. And one of my favorite sayings that she has is, when you feel those butterflies in your stomach, that's a good sign, right? That's your central nervous system gearing up the way it's hardwired to do to help you meet those challenges. And just think that it's those butterflies getting information to help you deal with that challenge. So I can recommend her.